Sarah Martinez had always been small for her age. At 26, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with a voice that squeaked when she got nervous. The other pilots at Henderson Regional Airport called her Squeaky behind her back, though they smiled politely to her face. What they didn't know was that Sarah had logged more flight hours than most of them combined, having started flying when she was just 14 years old with her grandfather's old Cessna. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at the airport before dawn, her worn leather flight bag slung over her shoulder. She worked as a medical transport pilot, flying emergency cases to larger hospitals in the city. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept her in the air, which was all she had ever wanted since she was a little girl watching planes overhead. The other pilots were gathered around the coffee machine, as usual, sharing stories about their weekend flights. Mark Thompson, who flew corporate jets for wealthy businessmen, was in the middle of describing his latest trip to Las Vegas when Sarah walked by. "Morning, Squeaky," he called out with a grin. "Try not to crash anything today." The group chuckled and Sarah felt her cheeks burn red. She had never crashed anything in her life, but somehow the nickname had stuck after a rough landing during a thunderstorm 6 months ago. Sarah grabbed her coffee and headed to the flight planning room. Today's schedule showed 3 routine medical transports, nothing too challenging. The weather was clear, and the aircraft was in perfect condition. She had been flying the same twin-engine Beechcraft King Air for 2 years now, and she knew every button, switch, and gauge by heart. The plane wasn't fancy, but it was reliable, and Sarah had grown to love its steady performance. As she reviewed her flight plans, dispatch called her radio. "Medical Transport 772, we have an urgent pickup at County General. Premature baby needs immediate transport to Children's Hospital downtown. Are you available for immediate departure?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Emergency flights were always stressful, but when children were involved, the pressure felt 10 times heavier. She checked her watch and calculated the flight time. If she left within the next 20 minutes, she could have the baby at the specialist hospital in under an hour. "Dispatch, this is 772. I'm ready for immediate departure. Send me the details," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. She gathered her charts and headed to the aircraft, performing her pre-flight inspection with extra care. Every bolt, every surface, every fluid level had to be perfect. Someone's life depended on it. The medical team arrived with the tiny patient just as Sarah finished her inspection. The baby was so small it could fit in her hand, connected to machines that beeped and hummed constantly. The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, climbed aboard with the flight nurse. "How long to Children's Hospital?" she asked Sarah. 45 minutes if the winds cooperate," Sarah answered, starting the engines. The familiar whine of the turbines spinning up was somehow comforting. As they lifted off from Henderson Regional, Sarah could see the other pilots through the window of the pilot lounge. Mark Thompson was probably telling another story about his glamorous flights to exotic destinations, but Sarah knew that what she was doing right now was more important than any corporate trip to Las Vegas. She was carrying precious cargo, and she would get this little fighter to the help they needed, no matter what. The first 30 minutes of the flight went smoothly. Sarah monitored the weather radar and maintained constant communication with air traffic control. The baby's condition seemed stable, and the medical team worked quietly in the cabin behind her. Everything was going according to plan until the radio crackled with an emergency message that would change everything. "All aircraft in the vicinity of Metro Airport. Be advised we have multiple casualties from a highway accident. Emergency vehicles are requesting immediate medical transport assistance. Any available aircraft with medical capabilities, please respond." Sarah's hands tightened on the controls. She looked at her fuel gauge and calculated distances in her head. She could help, but it would mean taking risks that most pilots wouldn't even consider. Sarah keyed her radio immediately. "Metro Control, this is Medical Transport 772. I have medical personnel on board and can assist after completing current patient transport to Children's Hospital. Estimated arrival in 12 minutes. The air traffic controller's voice came back immediately, relief evident in his tone. 772, thank you. We have multiple critical patients. How many can you transport?" The doctor behind Sarah had been listening to the radio conversation. She leaned forward and tapped Sarah on the shoulder. "I can stay and help with the accident victims. This baby is stable now, and the Children's Hospital team can take over." How many trips can you make? Sarah's mind raced through the calculations. Fuel, distance, aircraft weight limits, weather conditions. She had enough fuel for 3 round trips if she was careful. I can take 4 patients at a time depending on their condition, Sarah replied. We'll need to strip out everything non-essential to save weight. The doctor nodded grimly. She understood that every pound mattered when lives were at stake. Sarah pushed the throttles forward slightly, coaxing every bit of speed from the aircraft while staying within safe limits. They landed at Children's Hospital exactly 11 minutes later. The medical team was waiting with a specialized transport unit for the baby. As the tiny patient was carefully moved to the hospital equipment, Sarah was already calculating her next move. She would need to refuel quickly and get back to the accident scene as fast as possible. Every minute counted when people were bleeding on a highway. I'm staying here, the doctor told Sarah. Dr. Mitchell from emergency is coming with you. He's worked accident scenes before. Sarah nodded and began her pre-flight inspection for the second time that day. This time she had help. The ground crew was moving like a well-oiled machine, removing unnecessary equipment and preparing the cabin for emergency patients. Dr. Mitchell arrived just as Sarah finished refueling. He was younger than the first doctor, probably in his early 30s, with steady hands and calm eyes. I've done this before, he told Sarah as they climbed aboard. Just get us there safely and I'll handle the medical side. Sarah appreciated his confidence. She would need to focus entirely on flying, especially with the challenging conditions ahead. The accident scene was visible from 10 miles away. Smoke rose from what looked like a multi-vehicle collision on the main highway between 2 cities. Emergency vehicles filled the roadway, their red and blue lights flashing like a deadly Christmas display. Sarah contacted the ground commander on the emergency frequency. Ground command, this is Medical Transport 772. We have a doctor on board and can transport 4 critical patients. Where do you want us to land? 772. We have a makeshift landing zone set up in the field next to mile marker 47. Wind is from the southwest at 8 knots. Be advised we have power lines on the eastern approach. Sarah studied the terrain below. The landing zone was small, surrounded by obstacles with barely enough room for her aircraft. Most pilots would consider it too dangerous. But Sarah had trained for exactly this kind of situation. She lined up for approach, fighting a crosswind that tried to push the aircraft toward those power lines. Dr. Mitchell gripped his seat as the plane descended toward what looked like a postage stamp of clear ground. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, making tiny adjustments based on years of experience flying into challenging airports. The aircraft touched down perfectly, rolling to a stop just 50 feet from the emergency command post. The scene that greeted them was chaos. 3 cars and a truck had collided at high speed, leaving twisted metal scattered across both lanes of the highway. Paramedics and firefighters worked frantically to extract victims from the wreckage. Sarah kept the engines running while Dr. Mitchell jumped out to assess the patients. 4 people needed immediate transport to trauma centers, all with life-threatening injuries. Loading the patients took precious minutes, but Dr. Mitchell worked efficiently with the ground team. Sarah monitored the aircraft systems and calculated weight distribution as each stretcher was secured in the cabin. The aircraft was now at maximum capacity, every pound carefully distributed to maintain proper balance. One mistake in these calculations could be fatal for everyone on board. As they lifted off from the improvised landing zone, Sarah realized that word of her actions was already spreading on the emergency radio frequencies. Other pilots were listening, including those back at Henderson Regional. The same people who had called her squeaky just hours ago were now hearing her professional voice coordinating multiple emergency flights under conditions most of them would never attempt. The flight to Metro General Hospital was the longest 23 minutes of Sarah's life. One of the patients was losing blood pressure rapidly, despite Dr. Mitchell's efforts. Sarah pushed the aircraft to its maximum safe speed while fighting turbulence that seemed determined to make the doctor's job impossible. Every bump and shake could be fatal for the critical patients in the back. How much longer? Dr. Mitchell called from the cabin, his voice tight with concentration. 7 minutes, Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the instruments constantly. The engines were running hot from the extended high-power setting, but still within acceptable limits. She had to balance speed against the risk of mechanical failure. If the engines quit now, everyone would die. Metro General's helipad was busy with other emergency aircraft, but the tower controller gave Sarah priority clearance. Medical 772, you're cleared for immediate landing, Pad 2. Emergency medical team standing by. Sarah could see the trauma teams waiting as she approached, their equipment ready to receive the patients. The landing was perfect despite her exhaustion, and the patients were transferred in record time. I need to go back, Sarah told the ground crew chief. There are more people at the accident scene. The chief looked at her with concern. You've been flying for 6 hours straight. Don't you need rest? Sarah shook her head. Not while people are dying on that highway. She grabbed a quick cup of coffee and checked the aircraft systems while refueling. Everything looked good for another flight. Dr. Mitchell climbed back aboard, along with a trauma nurse who had volunteered for the return trip. The patients you brought in are going to make it, he told Sarah. Your flying saved their lives. Sarah felt a warm glow of satisfaction, but there was no time to celebrate. The radio was crackling with updates from the accident scene. More victims had been found in the wreckage, and the situation was getting worse. The second trip to the accident scene was even more challenging. Weather was moving in from the west, bringing low clouds and gusty winds. The makeshift landing zone was now muddy from all the emergency vehicle traffic, making the surface soft and unpredictable. Sarah had to adjust her approach to account for the changing conditions, using every bit of skill she had learned in 15 years of flying. This time the patients were even more critical. A young mother with internal injuries, an elderly man with multiple fractures, and 2 teenagers from the same family, both unconscious from head trauma. Dr. Mitchell worked with quiet efficiency, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. These patients needed surgery immediately, and every minute in the air was a minute closer to losing them. The return flight to Metro General was a nightmare of turbulence and radio chatter. Sarah flew by instinct, her hands automatically making the tiny corrections needed to keep the aircraft stable, while her mind focused on navigation through the deteriorating weather. The clouds were getting lower and she could see lightning in the distance. If the weather got much worse, she would have to stop flying altogether. They landed just as the first raindrops began hitting the windscreen. The medical teams were ready again and the patients were rushed into surgery within minutes of landing. Sarah watched them disappear into the hospital, then turned to prepare for what she hoped would be the final trip. Her fuel was running low, and her body was starting to feel the effects of hours of high-stress flying. One more trip, she told herself, checking the weather radar on her phone. The storm was moving faster than predicted, but she might have just enough time to get the remaining victims out before conditions became impossible. Dr. Mitchell and the nurse were refueling their own energy with coffee and sandwiches while Sarah ran through her pre-flight checks one more time. The radio crackled with an update from the ground commander. Medical 772. We have 2 more critical patients ready for transport. But be advised, weather is deteriorating rapidly. If you can't make it back tonight, we'll have to wait for ground transport. Sarah looked at the darkening sky and made her decision. Ground transport would take hours on the damaged highway. These patients didn't have hours. Ground command, this is 772. I'm en route for final pickup. Have the patients ready for immediate loading. She started the engines and began her taxi to the runway, knowing that this would be the most dangerous flight of her career. The weather was bad and getting worse, fuel was marginal, and she was exhausted. But 2 lives depended on her making it work. The third approach to the accident scene was like flying into hell. Rain hammered the windscreen so hard that Sarah could barely see the landing zone lights. Wind gusts rocked the aircraft violently, and she had to fight the controls with both hands to keep the plane on course. Lightning flashed nearby, temporarily blinding her night vision. Any sensible pilot would have turned back, but Sarah wasn't thinking about being sensible anymore. I can't see anything, Dr. Mitchell called from the cabin, gripping his seat as the aircraft bounced through the turbulence. How are you even flying in this? Sarah didn't answer because she needed every bit of concentration for the approach. The ground was rushing up fast through the rain, and she was depending entirely on the landing zone lights and her own experience to guide the aircraft down safely. The touchdown was hard but controlled. Sarah immediately applied the brakes and reversed the engines to stop the aircraft before it slid off the muddy makeshift runway. The nose wheel sank slightly into the soft ground but held firm. Emergency vehicles surrounded them within seconds, their crews moving with practiced efficiency despite the terrible weather conditions. The final 2 patients were loaded quickly. Both had been trapped in the wreckage for hours and were in critical condition. One was a construction worker whose truck had been crushed in the initial collision. The other was a grandmother who had been driving to visit her family when the accident happened. Dr. Mitchell and the nurse worked frantically to stabilize them as Sarah prepared for what would be the most challenging takeoff of her life. The aircraft was heavy with patients and medical equipment. The runway was soft and slippery, and visibility was nearly zero. Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt the engines respond with a reassuring surge of power. The aircraft accelerated slowly through the mud. Every foot of movement a small victory against the forces trying to keep them on the ground. Finally, mercifully, the wheels lifted off and they were flying again. The flight back to Metro General was a battle against nature itself. Sarah flew on instruments alone, trusting her training in the aircraft's navigation systems to guide them through the storm. Lightning illuminated the clouds around them in brilliant, terrifying flashes. Turbulence threw the aircraft around like a toy, making the doctor's work nearly impossible. But somehow they stayed in the air. Metro Tower, this is Medical 772 requesting priority approach. We have 2 critical patients on board. The tower controller's voice came back immediately, professional despite the challenging conditions. 772, you're cleared for immediate approach, runway 27. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Be advised, wind is gusting to 40 knots. Sarah lined up for the approach, fighting crosswinds that tried to push the aircraft off course. The runway lights appeared through the rain like a string of pearls, and she focused on them with laser intensity. Dr. Mitchell called from the cabin that one of the patients was crashing, his vital signs dropping rapidly. Sarah pushed the aircraft harder, knowing that seconds might make the difference between life and death. The landing was rough but successful. Emergency teams swarmed the aircraft as soon as it stopped rolling, transferring the patients to waiting ambulances with choreographed precision. Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. She had completed 3 round trips in impossible conditions, transporting 10 critical patients to safety. But she wouldn't know if it was worth it until she learned whether they survived. Dr. Mitchell appeared at the cockpit door, his scrubs stained with blood and sweat. I've been doing this for 8 years, he told Sarah, and I've never seen flying like that. You just saved 10 lives tonight. Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her, but she was too tired to process it fully. She just nodded and began the shutdown checklist, going through the familiar routine that would put the aircraft to bed after its hardest day of work. The ground crew chief approached as Sarah finished her post-flight inspection. The tower has been getting calls all evening, he told her. Every pilot in 3 states has been listening to your radio work tonight. They're calling you Angel-01 now because you've been a guardian angel for those accident victims. Sarah was too exhausted to appreciate the significance of the nickname. She just wanted to go home and sleep. But as she gathered her flight bag and headed toward the terminal, Sarah couldn't help but think about the other pilots back at Henderson Regional. The same people who had called her Squeaky that morning had been listening to her coordinate emergency flights under conditions they wouldn't have attempted. Tomorrow, when she walked into the pilot lounge, things would be different. She had proven something important not just to them, but to herself. The storm was finally passing as Sarah reached her car. Through the clearing clouds, she could see stars beginning to appear. Somewhere in the hospital behind her, 10 people were fighting for their lives because she had been willing to fly when no one else would. Whether they called her Squeaky or Angel-01 didn't matter. What mattered was that she had done her job when it counted most. Sarah arrived at Henderson Regional the next morning to find a completely different atmosphere waiting for her. The usual group of pilots was gathered around the coffee machine, but instead of casual conversation, they were engaged in serious discussion about the previous night's emergency flights. When Sarah walked through the door, the room fell silent and every head turned toward her. Mark Thompson was the first to speak. Sarah, he said, using her real name for the first time in months, we heard everything on the radio last night. That was some incredible flying. The other pilots nodded in agreement, their expressions showing a respect that hadn't been there the day before. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, not with embarrassment this time, but with pride. I just did my job, she replied quietly, hanging up her flight jacket. But even as she said it, Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. She had gone far beyond the normal requirements of her job, pushing herself and her aircraft to the limits to save lives. The other pilots knew it too, and their newfound respect was evident in every interaction throughout the morning. The airport manager, Bill Henderson, appeared in the pilot lounge around 10 o'clock. He was carrying a stack of newspapers and wearing an expression Sarah had never seen before. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice serious but not unfriendly. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, wondering if she was in trouble for exceeding normal operating procedures during the emergency flights. They walked to his office in silence, passing ground crew members who nodded respectfully as Sarah went by. Word had spread quickly throughout the airport community about the previous night's heroics. Bill closed the door behind them and gestured for Sarah to sit down. "First things first," he said. "The hospital called this morning. 9 of the 10 patients you transported are going to make full recoveries. The 10th is stable and expected to survive." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. All those risks, all that stress, all those dangerous approaches in terrible weather had been worth it. 10 families would not be planning funerals because she had been willing to fly when conditions seemed impossible. "There's more," Bill continued, spreading the newspapers across his desk. "You've made the news." The headlines were dramatic. "Local pilot saves 10 lives in storm," read the main paper. "Angel pilot defies weather to rescue accident victims," proclaimed another. There were photos of the accident scene of the aircraft at Metro General, and somehow someone had managed to get a picture of Sarah during one of the patient transfers. She looked small and tired but determined, her face set with concentration as medical teams worked around her aircraft. "The phone has been ringing all morning," Bill told her. "News stations want interviews. The governor's office wants to give you an award. And I've had calls from 3 major airlines asking about your employment status." Sarah stared at him in shock. She had never imagined that doing her job, even under extreme circumstances, would generate this kind of attention. "What does this mean?" she asked, still trying to process the sudden change in her circumstances. Bill leaned back in his chair and smiled. "It means you've proven what some of us already knew. You're one of the best pilots in the state. Maybe in the country. Those airline calls weren't casual inquiries. They want to hire you." The biggest surprise came later that afternoon when Sarah was performing a routine pre-flight inspection. A black sedan pulled up to the airport terminal and 2 men in suits got out. They looked official, government types, and Sarah wondered what kind of trouble she might be in. Turns out it was the opposite of trouble. "Ms. Martinez," the older man said, extending his hand. "I'm Colonel Williams from the Air National Guard. This is Major Rodriguez from the Emergency Response Division. We'd like to talk to you about your flying last night." Sarah shook their hands nervously, still not sure what to expect. They sat in the airport conference room while Colonel Williams explained their proposal. "We've been looking for pilots with exactly your skills and temperament for our emergency response team. The Guard operates specialized aircraft for disaster relief, medical evacuation, and search and rescue operations. Your performance last night shows you have the judgment and skill we need." Major Rodriguez opened a folder and showed Sarah photographs of aircraft she had only dreamed of flying. Sophisticated helicopters, twin-engine turboprops designed specifically for emergency operations, and jets equipped with state-of-the-art medical facilities. "You would maintain your civilian job," he explained, "but train with us on weekends and be available for major emergencies throughout the region." Sarah looked at the photos and felt her heart racing with excitement. These were the kind of aircraft and missions she had always imagined flying, but never thought would be available to someone like her. "What would this involve?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 6 months of intensive training, then regular exercises with emergency response teams throughout the state. When disasters hit, floods, earthquakes, major accidents like last night, you would be part of the first response team. It's dangerous work, but you've already proven you can handle that. Colonel Williams watched her face carefully as he spoke. The decision wasn't difficult. Sarah had spent her entire flying career preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity, even though she hadn't known it at the time. All those hours practicing precision approaches in challenging conditions, all that experience flying medical transports, all those times she had pushed herself to be better than anyone expected had led to this moment. The girl they had called Squeaky was being offered a chance to become a real angel of mercy. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the hangar at the Air National Guard base wearing a flight suit with Angel-01 embroidered on the name patch. The training had been intense, pushing her flying skills to levels she hadn't known were possible. She had learned to fly helicopters, operate sophisticated rescue equipment, and coordinate complex emergency operations involving multiple agencies. But most importantly, She had gained confidence in herself as a pilot and as a leader. The call came on a Saturday morning. A major earthquake had struck 200 miles south, collapsing buildings and trapping dozens of people in the rubble. Sarah and her team were airborne within 30 minutes, flying a specially equipped helicopter toward the disaster zone. As they approached the affected area, Sarah could see the devastation below. Entire city blocks had been reduced to rubble, and emergency vehicles filled every available street. Angel-01, this is Disaster Command. We need you to extract a medical team from a collapsed hospital. They've been trapped for 6 hours and we're losing radio contact. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began scanning the destruction below for the target building. The hospital was partially collapsed, its upper floors pancaked onto the lower levels. Somewhere in that mess, doctors and nurses were waiting for rescue. The landing zone was impossibly small, a parking lot surrounded by damaged buildings and power lines. Sarah approached carefully, using every skill she had learned during training. The helicopter settled onto the asphalt with precision, and her rescue team immediately deployed toward the building. 20 minutes later, they emerged with 4 medical personnel who had been trapped when the earthquake struck. As they lifted off with the rescued medical team, Sarah's radio crackled with another urgent request. Angel-01, we have reports of a school bus that went into the river during the quake. Children are trapped inside, approximately 1 mile downstream from the main bridge. Sarah's heart pounded as she banked the helicopter toward the river. Children in danger brought back memories of that first emergency flight with the premature baby. The school bus was barely visible above the water, wedged against a partially submerged tree. Sarah could see small faces pressed against the rear windows, and her chest tightened with the urgency of the situation. The rescue would require hovering over fast-moving water while her team rappelled down to the bus. One mistake could cost dozens of young lives. Angel-01, be advised the bus is shifting position. Current is very strong. The ground commander's voice carried the tension everyone was feeling. Sarah positioned the helicopter precisely over the bus, fighting wind and downdrafts from the rotor wash. Her team leader rappelled down and began the dangerous process of extracting children through the emergency exit. One by one, terrified children were lifted to safety. Sarah held the helicopter steady despite the challenging conditions, her hands rock solid on the controls. The bus lurched downstream twice during the rescue, but Sarah adjusted position instantly, keeping her team safe while they worked. After what felt like hours but was actually 37 minutes, the last child was pulled from the bus just before it broke free and disappeared beneath the water. The rescue made national news. Video from news helicopters showed Sarah's aircraft hovering over the raging river, while children were lifted to safety. But for Sarah, the real reward came 3 days later when she received a handwritten letter from one of the rescued students. "Dear Angel Lady," it read in crayon, "thank you for saving us. My mom says you are a real hero. I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up." Back at Henderson Regional Airport, the atmosphere had changed permanently. The other pilots no longer saw Sarah as the small, quiet woman who squeaked when she got nervous. They saw Angel-01, the pilot who flew impossible missions in impossible conditions. Mark Thompson approached her one morning with a humility she had never seen from him before. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "We all do. We judged you by your size and your voice instead of your skill and your heart. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." Sarah accepted his apology graciously, but she wasn't angry anymore. She had proven everything she needed to prove, both to others and to herself. The airlines were still calling with job offers. Major carriers wanted to hire the pilot who had become famous for her emergency flying. But Sarah had found her calling with the Guard and her medical transport work. She was saving lives on a regular basis, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aviation, and inspiring young people to pursue their dreams regardless of what others might think. The nickname Angel-01 had stuck, not just with the emergency response community, but with pilots throughout the region. Flight controllers used it automatically now, and Sarah wore it with pride. She had gone from being laughed at for her call sign to being respected for her actions. The transformation was complete, but Sarah knew it had always been inside her, waiting for the right moment to emerge. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sometimes think about that first emergency flight with the premature baby. If she hadn't been willing to respond to the highway accident call that day, none of the subsequent events would have happened. 10 people might have died. Dozens of others would never have been rescued from earthquakes and floods, and she would still be squeaky to her fellow pilots. Sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as routine radio calls on ordinary Tuesday mornings.